Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to ICOM Croatia and the National University and Library of Zagreb and the Ethnographic Museum for putting this conference together and including me in the lineup. You all have so much more experience of dealing with crises, particularly after the last year's 2 earthquakes plus the pandemic. And I admire your fortitude and resilience, both of which are leadership qualities, which are very useful. I'll be talking about the concept of leadership and how it applies in an emergency situation. Leadership is at once an easily understood concept and also very misunderstood. In one word, there are many diverse meanings and different ways of looking at it. Sometimes it's about hierarchy and authorities, and for other people, it's more collaborative and democratic. And it's easy to be simplistic about this complex human construct that enables organizations and people to work together and achieve together. It is complex and is not very easily definable. And there's a tendency in many leadership texts to focus on leadership from the point of view of desired traits like these ones, or competencies, which are very necessary. However, it is also important to view leadership as a social interaction where these traits and behaviors and the influence the effectiveness of leadership depending on the circumstances at play and the people and the personalities being led. So it's much more adaptive. And there's a tendency also to focus on the leader as an individual rather than leadership and how it actually exists within and throughout a team or an organization. So whilst acknowledging that specialist traits and specific traits and behaviors can influence the effectiveness of an individual's leadership capability, it is also important to be aware that leadership should be more focused on the nature of the challenge and the collective rather than the individual. And also it should be adaptable and flexible rather than sort of one size fits all. So in extending the concept of leadership beyond the individual, we broaden the issue into understand leadership as a process within complex human relationships that drive our collective achievements. So this distributes leadership throughout an organization, and that's brought about by interactive relationships between the leader and the followers. So this relationship is more symbiotic in its nature, and it's two-way communication. It's not a top-down approach, and leadership appears across the organization and doesn't rest solely with the leader exerting their particular leadership competencies and behaviors. So leadership is an amalgamation of both social process and the individual's traits. And this is a model really which is more adapted to leading in crisis, but the leader needs to have developed this practice in the organization before the crisis hits. That's part of the emergency preparedness, is in fact to have a resilient organization. So the command and control model of leadership, where the leader is directive, is like the human body, where the brain is the central control unit, with nerves and muscles being controlled by the brain. The process model of leadership is more akin to how an octopus works. The head makes decisions in response to what it senses through its 8 tentacles. However, rather than manage all the way down to tentacle level in a kind of centralized way in which our brains work, the octopus brain relies on the arms to do what they do best in response to what they are sensing locally. So the brain can send a tentacle out in a certain direction at a given speed, but 80% of the muscle activity is governed by the nervous system in the arm itself and not by the brain of the octopus. The octopus brain makes sure that all 8 arms are working together to coordinate, to move it in a certain direction, but each arm responds independently to its local situation. For example, every cell of octopus skin can instantly change color each cell adapting individually in response to the environment in its immediate vicinity, with no help from the brain. So how does this correlate to process leadership, where leadership is distributed through the organization? So the leader authorizes autonomy within limits such as time or resources, because they have the helicopter view based on the constant communication feedback that is flowing from the teams on the ground to the leader, and also between the teams. So what are the characteristics of crisis, and how does process leadership apply to them? Well, a crisis is the ultimate test of leadership, and it is relentless in revealing core weaknesses and in individuals and in organizations, but it also can show hidden strengths. A crisis can begin with an emergency which is sudden and unforeseen and has extremely negative consequences, as we all know. And those can be existential. They can cause an existential threat. And it brings with it a high degree of instability, which can be a turning point, because its impacts can be so severe that nothing will be the same again. A crisis can therefore have a significant impact on the emotional needs and behaviours of humans. Leadership competencies or behaviours are the tool with which the leader can manage the crisis situation as it's happening. Innate or learned, her or his personal attributes with which he manages the crisis are part of his leadership skills. The leadership process within which he has set up or she has set up is the systems that are in place before the crisis hits and are based on the leadership relationships within the organization. This process focuses on collective leadership, where the purpose and goals of the organization are co-created in a system which is networked, where communication happens vertically, horizontally, and where there's dispersed and participative leadership. This takes time to develop in an organization. It is leaders who will craft the organization so that it has these strengths. This process makes it more resilient because it is more cohesive as an organization. When disaster strikes, it is the quality of the relationship a leader has with his or her followers and the relationship the followers have with each other and their stakeholders that will enable the organization to come through the adversity. So let's look at leadership crisis in situations and how leaders use their traits and the process that they have built into the organization. Uncertainty brings with it emotions that cause people to act or not act. The instability of the crisis can cause paralysis in an organization which is already struggling against the effects of the crisis, which might pose an existential threat. Will the organization survive this crisis? What does the future hold for the people involved in it? It is in this chaotic and ambiguous emotional environment that leaders must lead and lead well. This is where the leader needs to exert calm and control to motivate the team and keep them focused on the changing goals of mitigating the disaster. With regards to process in the organization, if the organization has in place effective communications between teams and with the leader, the specific crisis communication can take those already established paths. If the leadership has regularly communicated the possibility of a crisis and its mitigation plans to the teams, then the response to any crisis will be less emotionally charged because there will be an organizational-wide common understanding of working together to respond. Clear communication of the crisis-specific mission and goals will help to build a roadmap that the teams can get behind and be reassured by. This sense of purpose in itself has a clear stabilizing effect and helps to mitigate anxiety in the organization. A crisis isn't usually expected, so it is a question of creating a sense of structure within which the teams can work. Initial fact-finding phases require well thought out lines of communication and feedback. The leader will be outwardly communicating with stakeholders, inwardly receiving information from the teams, and delegating and devolving activity within limits. A phased structure of timed points at which all information is shared with all teams creates a framework within which distributed activity and fact-finding can operate. Although the specific characteristics of the crisis cannot be predicted, it is possible to stress test the organization's procedures, thinking, and behaviors. There is much to be learned from exercises, as you all know, which create unpredictable scenarios for teams to experience some of the quick thinking and behaviors that they need in a crisis. In crisis situations that could involve life and death, leaders must learn to deal with their own emotions, as well as the emotional chaos of the people in the organization. To do this, they have to contain the anxiety of themselves and of their teams. And the role of the leader here is to provide psychological safety. The key elements of this are feeling in control, clear goals and sense of direction, and inspiring values. Leaders do this by word, deed, and action. Being genuine and empathetic and creating a safe environment for people to express themselves is crucial to mitigating the emotional impact of a crisis, and therefore the negative impact on the performance of the teams. In the chaos of the fast-moving crisis, there is lack of information just when people need it most. This is where the leader needs to become the central figure, the head of the octopus, making the decisions, moving the team through the unfolding disaster, giving them enough autonomy on the ground to tackle the problems, using the distributed communication feedback loops to make decisions. During a crisis, a wrong decision that motivates action is better than doing nothing. Quick decision-making is vital, even though those decisions are being made with scanty information. The leader is making the decision because it needs to be made, and it's the best decision at that particular point in time because the context is continually changing and information is in short supply. When the immediate catastrophe has been averted, it's time to lead the organization into the new future. This might be a weary group of people who are exhausted and unmotivated by the changes that the crisis has brought. It requires recognition of the effort and praise for what has worked and acknowledgement of the changes that are necessary to move on and refocus the organization in the new normal. Just on a final, more positive note, crises are not usually entirely negative. They bring opportunity for creativity, innovation, and most importantly for us humans, they bring empowerment. Handling a crisis promotes confidence and personal growth. The crisis tests our abilities and proves to us that we are up to the challenge. Sharing the experience of overcoming a crisis can create a greater sense of camaraderie and community in the organization, and some individuals may discover strengths that they didn't know they had. The organization itself will certainly be stronger too. Thank you.